Hi, my name's Andrew Francis, and today we're going to continue on with our series on Isaiah. We'll be looking at chapters 17 and 18. Previously, Isaiah had prophesied against Philistia and Moab, as we discussed last week. In this next section, Isaiah deals with Judah's northern neighbours, Damascus and Ephraim, which represents Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel. The main focus will be upon Israel itself, as we will see indicated from verse 3. John Oswalt tells us that Damascus was one of the most strategic cities of the ancient world because of its position as the gateway to the only negotiable trade route by the caravans of the time between Mesopotamia and Egypt. Because of its position, it became a place of great influence, an influence that far exceeded its size. But Damascus was all but destroyed by Shalmaneser in 732 BC, as Isaiah prophesied. An oracle concerning Damascus, chapter 17 verses 1 to 6. Behold, Damascus will cease to be a city and will become a heap of ruins. The cities of Aroer are deserted, they will be for flocks, which will lie down and none will make them afraid. The fortress will disappear from Ephraim and the kingdom from Damascus, and the remnant of Syria will be like the glory of the children of Israel, declares the Lord of hosts. And in that day the glory of Jacob will be brought low, and the fat of his flesh will grow lean. And it shall be as when the reaper gathers standing grain, and his arm harvests the ears. And as when one gleans the ears of grain in the valley of Rephaim. Gleanings will be left in it, as when an olive tree is beaten. 2 or 3 berries in the top of the highest bough, 4 or 5 on the branches of a fruit tree, declares the Lord God of Israel. So Isaiah is linking the two nations together in this prophecy, alerting us to the fact that just as the two nations had sought to protect themselves through an alliance with one another, so too would their destruction also be linked together. Oswald explains that the word glory in Hebrew carries with it connotations of permanence, abundance, significance, and reality. It is evident that according to Isaiah, such glory will be exposed as a pretentious, empty shell. Like Jesus describing Israel's leaders as whitewashed tombs, so too will be these two powers. Isaiah graphically describes Israel as similar to the flaps of skin left hanging off a fat man when he has lost his weight. Further to this, he uses agricultural analogies, describing Israel like a field that has been left empty after harvesting, or like an olive tree which has had the majority of its olives picked. In other words, there will be very little left. The good news is, of course, that there will be a remnant spared. Something will be left, like a few olives on the tree or a few grains left on the stalks. This is also a reminder to Judah that they don't need to fear their neighbours. God is the only one that they need to fear. And so we continue in verses 7 to 11. In that day, man will look to his Maker, and his eyes will look on the Holy One of Israel. He will not look to the altars, the work of his hands, and he will not look on what his own fingers have made, either the Asherim or the altars of incense. In that day, their strong cities will be like the deserted places of the wooded heights, and the hilltops, which they deserted because of the children of Israel, and there will be desolation. For you have forgotten the God of your salvation, and have not remembered the rock of your refuge. Therefore, though you plant pleasant plants and sow the vine branch of a stranger, though you make them grow on the day that you plant them, and make them blossom in the morning that you sow, yet the harvest will flee away in a day of grief and incurable pain. The tragedy of this prophecy is that following all the destruction wrought against Israel, finally they will come to their senses, leave behind their altars and idolatry, and look only to Yahweh their Maker and the Holy One of Israel. Finally, they will recognize that the work of their own hands cannot save them. And this continues to be a relevant and important lesson in our own times, as we can just as easily rely on our own goodness, the work of our hands, our abilities, our education, and our money, rather than wholeheartedly trusting in God. Asherah was a female god and was understood as the wife of El, the Canaanite high god. She was a mother goddess. As a god of fertility, she was worshipped through temple prostitution. It was as if people believed that life could be manipulated through sexual expression, something which sounds very similar to the popular belief of today, in which people believe that their happiness and purpose can mainly be found through the expression of their sexual desires. Instead of looking to God who created life, and in whom life can be found, they chase these lesser gods, which ultimately prove to be as empty as the nation would become. Israel had gained the promised land and become the nation it was because of Yahweh. Likewise, because of Yahweh, Israel had been able to destroy many nations who had relied on the very gods and idols that the people of Israel were now turning to. Despite the fact that Israel had been warned time and time again to return to the Lord and could have potentially averted the disaster that would come upon them, they had refused to listen to God's messengers, the prophets, and now would have to submit to the painful rod of God's correction and discipline. Sadly, they now would only return to Yahweh after near total destruction. They would become like the sacred high places and wooded places where they had worshipped the gods, which were now emptied of people. And in verse 10, when Isaiah speaks of Israel's forgetting and not remembering, he's not simply speaking of some sort of mental recall, but rather a life that evidenced itself in godly behaviour. And I think hopefully we'll all testify to the reality. The more that we come to know Jesus and the Father, the more our life and our actions are transformed. As I discussed in a previous lesson, the decision my wife and I have often made to open our homes to people has flowed directly out of our experience and knowledge of God. And whilst I'm not suggesting that everyone should do as we've done and open their homes to homeless people or to single mothers or what have you, nonetheless, at times I've wondered when I talk with some believers whether they have really met the same Jesus that I have met. James tells us that faith without works, and therefore actions, is dead. And John Oswald writes, "If God has touched my life, yet my life is not different, then I have not perceived the implications of that touch, and it is in fact void of significance." As Oswald also points out, Israel probably still would have claimed to be Yahweh worshippers. They would have said that Yahweh is their God, and yet they also continue to worship other gods and indulge in pagan practices. The final verses of this section just highlight that no matter how brilliant, clever, rich or charismatic we might be, and no matter how much ability we might have to make things happen, without God our accomplishments will simply lead to disappointment and emptiness. And so we read from verse 12 to 14. "Ah, the thunder of many peoples, they thunder like the thundering of the sea. Ah, the roar of nations, they roar like the roaring of mighty waters. The nations roar like the roaring of many waters, and he will rebuke them, and they will flee far away. Chase like chaff on the mountains before the wind, and whirling dust before the storm. At evening time, behold terror, before morning they are no more. This is the portion of those who loot us, and the lot of those who plunder us." Isaiah now discusses what will happen to the nations that seem to be causing so much destruction everywhere. They're actually soon going to appear as chaff being blown by the winds. This is a perspective God's people need to somehow keep in a world where it seems as if Satan and his forces are stronger than God and his kingdom. Yes, Assyria will bring great destruction. Yes, at the time it seemed as if Assyria's armies were invincible against all the known nations. And yes, it was hard to believe that the God who cannot be seen by human eyes can intervene so quickly and radically that even such world powers will seem as nothing. And yet this is a point I think we've continued to highlight. Whatever nation we live in, it's easy to believe that the forces of darkness are such that they are somehow gaining the power and the upper hand over God or over his people. And yet as God's people, somehow we must continue to trust that our God reigns, and when he determines, no human power or demonic power will stand before him. The devil and his demons are defeated already, and the human beings that continue to cause havoc and trouble and that submit to the demonic forces, willingly or even unknowingly, will just as quickly be destroyed and defeated as the armies of Assyria were. And so we continue on with Isaiah 18 verses 1 to 7, an oracle concerning Cush. "Ah, land of whirring wings, that is beyond the rivers of Cush, which sends ambassadors by the sea and vessels of papyrus on the waters. Go, you swift messengers, to a nation tall and smooth, to a people feared near and far, a nation mighty and conquering, whose land the rivers divide. All you inhabitants of the world, you who dwell on the earth, when a signal is raised in the mountains, look. When a trumpet is blown, hear. For thus the Lord said to me, I will quietly look from my dwelling, like clear heat in sunshine, like a cloud of dew in the heat of harvest. For before the harvest, when the blossom is over and the flower becomes a ripening grape, he cuts off the shoots with pruning hooks, and the spreading branches he lops off and clears away." They shall all of them be left to the birds of prey of the mountains and to the beasts of the earth. And the birds of prey will summer on them, and all the beasts of the earth will winter on them. At that time tribute will be brought to the Lord of hosts from a people tall and smooth, from a people feared near and far, a nation mighty and conquering, whose land the rivers divide, to Mount Zion, the place of the name of the Lord of hosts. As we look at chapter 18, the English Standard Version, which I'm reading from, has a heading, an oracle concerning Cush. And it needs to be pointed out that this is not something actually evident within the manuscripts themselves, and so is possibly an unfair addition. Yes, Isaiah is speaking of Cush, but unlike other oracles or prophetic burdens, this is not a message to Cush, but rather a message about Cush, and the part that their messengers will play. Cush included in its borders what is known as modern-day Ethiopia. It was in Isaiah's day the end of the known world. And so it's difficult to know whether Isaiah is speaking literally of Cush or symbolically of messengers coming from the ends of the earth. We do know in 715 BC, Egypt was ruled by a Nubian or Cushite dynasty, and there may have been many envoys sent to stir up revolt against the Assyrians. The whirring wings spoken of may have been insects, or it may have been a reference to the boats skimming across the water. The messengers from the ends of the earth are coming to let those who are destroying the world know that God is going to act. The message is a strange one. It's not a message of great overwhelming action on God's behalf. It is not the storm or the wind that's described of when Elijah is waiting on God. Rather, it seems that somehow in quietness and stillness God's actions are going to be discerned, which of course is similar to the voice that came out of the stillness in 1 Kings when Elijah is waiting on God. And so we hear that God looks quietly from his dwelling. You see, God is not perturbed or overwhelmed by the actions of superpowers and their vast armies. When he is ready, he simply and quietly intervenes. And this, of course, requires the eyes of faith by his people to see that it's in the quiet actions of God, often behind the scenes, in seemingly obscure ways, such as in the birth of a baby to a teenage girl in Bethlehem. Only those with eyes to see understood the significance of the baby and the impact he would have on the world. And even the people who saw the truth about this baby, people like Simeon or Anna, who themselves were probably virtual nobodies, or the shepherds who heard from the angels. Other more powerful and influential people such as Herod, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the priests, the high priest, they however failed to see in Jesus the actions of God. God will act, and his actions will remove whoever and whatever stands in the way of his purposes and plans. Some of his actions will see small and seemingly insignificant things take place, but they will also cause the defeat and destruction of mighty armies that will take months for their bodies to be consumed by birds and beasts alike. Isaiah 37 verse 36 tells us that an angel of the Lord killed 185,000 soldiers of the Assyrian army when they mocked the God of Judah. At the end of this section, Isaiah tells us that the people from Cush or from the ends of the earth, people feared near and far, will come and pay tribute to God. This passage reminds me of the wise men from the east who brought their gifts to Jesus. Even their coming is probably symbolic of times when people from many nations will flock to Jesus, bringing their offerings and offering their lives to the true one and only King, our Saviour. God bless you.